my research touches on a few areas of interest. It's to do with land, identity, history, cosmology, and ancestors. In particular, cosmology and ancestors. So although the group I conducted research on identify as Rastafari, essentially my work focuses much more on the Maori aspects of their identity and being. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing today, hopefully, is it's just to present you with an overview of the landscape, the background of my work, and hopefully from there we can go on and have some interesting questions or discussions. I'm just going to keep it quite general. There won't be too much theory until I come to the end, maybe, if I have enough time, if I have a little time and you're not asleep by then. So the talk today is going to be drawing on my PhD research, and my thesis was called Continuity, Communion and the Dread. You may get an idea why as we go along. So without further ado, I'll kick on. All right, I'm going to be allowing my slides to take the lead, and I'll fill in as we go. Okay. So as you can see, I was drawn to my research topic after first visiting New Zealand on holiday a long time ago in 1999, and on that occasion I went to Christchurch, and I was invited by some friends, and I'd heard lots about New Zealand. I wanted to see it geographically. I was interested in the culture, but interested in the environment, and I really enjoyed all the New Zealanders that I met. So I was curious to see the country for myself. Anywhere that has, rainforests and glaciers, I thought would be an interesting place to take a look at. Anyway, when I got there, what struck me the most was I'd heard about Maori gangs at that time, and Christchurch, for those of you who don't know, has a bit of a reputation for both gangs on both sides of the divide. So you have these Maori gangs who are, have quite a bad reputation, and you have far-right white supremacist gangs also. So I was really struck when I discovered being in Christchurch just how interested people were in seeing me. I had my dreadlocks at that time also, and I was just blown away with the warm welcome that I received. And more than that, I was also blown away with their interest in reggae and Rastafari, and not just any reggae music, but a particular genre of reggae music, roots reggae music, from the 1970s in particular. So from there, in the years that followed, I began studying anthropology, and then when it came, I managed to wangle my way onto a PhD program, and the advice I was given was, if you're going to do a PhD, choose somewhere you'd like to live for a while, and a place you'd enjoy. So I thought, okay, New Zealand, I'll go there. Because once again, I was just struck with the reception I received. I mean, I'd be walking past these Maori gangs in their cars with blacked out windows, and they'd wind their windows down and they'd salute me, "Hey bro, Rastafari!" So I was just like, and my friends who I was with, they were Kiwi, and they were afraid. They said, "Oh no, there's parts of town we can't go," and yet when I strayed into these areas, all I got was love. So I thought, okay, these guys aren't so scary, they're kind of cool. So I was naive, I wasn't smart enough to be scared. So I went along. So anyway, come my research now, I was interested in this question of why Rastafari had such an impact in New Zealand, in particular amongst Polynesians, and Maori. Rastafari, as many of you will know, has spread globally. 1970s and 80s in particular, the music reached an international audience, and New Zealand was just one of the places in which Rastafari really took root. However, when I began studying preparing for my research, I came across this particular group on the east coast of New Zealand. I'll show you more as we go on. And they struck me as being something quite considerably different from any other Rastafari group I'd heard about or known. For a start, Rastafari, they seem to sort of like reject two of the key tenets of Rastafari. One in particular was the Afrocentric nature of the movement. These guys were not Afrocentric, so much so that whenever I'd speak to a New Zealander or a Maori about my research and I told them where I was going to study, I was generally met with a pretty hostile reaction to the people I'd chosen to study. I mean, some would say, "Oh, they're not proper Rasta because they wear facial tattoos and they worship Maori gods." Others would say they're not proper Maori because they're following this foreign belief system. So I was. Others would say that they're just gangsters. Others would say that they're not interested in Rastafari as a belief system. They're only interested in smoking weed and listening to reggae music. I know something is wrong with me because I didn't listen to any of this, and I wanted to find out more. For me, I was really interested in how all of these facets of their identity would come together. So here in the picture, this picture was taken. So first of all, I'll say my research began in 2007. I spent 25 months on most of it on the east coast of New Zealand. I spent about 7 months in Auckland in preparation. That's a whole nother story we might come on to at some point. So I was on the east coast for about 18 months, living in and around the Dread. Here you see me with 3 members. The guy behind me with the guitar is Tiahi. He's recognised by everyone as the leader of the group. Sat beside him in the green jersey and the hat. That's Tawhito Ho, whose name means old and new. That in itself is interesting. He's kind of like a real spiritual presence amongst the group. He's seen as quite a taboo being. And this guy here, that guy, I can't do the pointing. The guy on the left, as you see it, that's Hori Kuri. He's an outsider. He's from Ngāti Kuri, which is in the Northlands of New Zealand. The tribe's located in the Northlands, New Zealand, and they are the traditional enemies of the people amongst whom I studied. So the group amongst I studied, Tiahi, Tawhito Ho, they are Ngāti Porou. I think they're the second largest iwi or tribe in New Zealand, and they have a reputation for being quite outspoken, quite wild and unruly, and very independent. Okay, so that's just a little taste. So on to the question of why Rastafari. One of the main reasons that have been posited for the arrival of Rastafari in New Zealand was Bob Marley's concert tour in 1979. as part of his, I think it's the Babylon by Bus tour, he toured the Pacific and Asia, and New Zealand was one of the stops. And on the, I think it's 18th of April 1979, he performed a concert at Western Springs, and this concert alone is said to have been a major factor in many Polynesians converting to Rasta. Apparently there was this kind of like overnight efflorescence of conversions. Prior to that, the main kind of like external influence on Polynesian political activism had been the Black Panther movement of the US. So in Auckland and elsewhere, there was a group called the Polynesian Panthers, who carried themselves very much like the Black Panthers. They wore the black berets, black leather jackets, black polo necks, the whole shebang. And many of those guys converted to Rastafari, or several of those guys converted to Rastafari and set up the first official Rastafari group in New Zealand, which was ordained by a leader of the Rastafari movement from Jamaica, came over and ordained this group. It was called the 12 Tribes of Israel group. In this picture you see Bob Marley on his official welcome, his Maori welcome, called a porphyry. And here you see him being, this is quite a famous picture of him about to be welcomed onto a marae for the first time. Bob Marley is a major influence on, like I said, he's a major influence on the conversion to Rastafari. But for the Dread, who I conducted my study amongst, he's only a component. Their belief system is, or their system of ideas, or kaupapa, which means philosophy, brings together various influences, and reggae and Rastafari is one. Another influence, hope I get this right, is Tukorti. Tukorti was a Maori class as a guerrilla who fought, well, he didn't fight actually, he was basically on the run from British colonial forces in the 1860s. He was originally, I don't know how much, this is all important, I have to give you a little bit of historical background in order to try and make sense of where the Dread are coming from. So Tukorti was accused of being a Ho-Ho spy. The Ho-Ho was a guerrilla movement who fought the British settlement in the late 1850s and early 1860s. And their plan was to basically drive the British off the island after a series of wars which came about over disputes over the Treaty of Waitangi, land settlement claims. Okay, so Tukorti, according to many, was falsely arrested and imprisoned on the Chatham Islands, which is off the coast off the east coast of New Zealand, which was a prison garrison. And he was held there alongside lots of Ho-Ho captives. The Ho-Ho were...
was he a Ho-Ho?
He was accused of being Ho-Ho by the government, but he himself always denied that he wasn't. Tukorti refused. He was, as part of his prophecy when he was born, he was told that he would be a leader and he should not follow anyone else. So when the Ho-Ho movement gathered pace in New Zealand, he refused to join them, right, waiting for his time. Okay, so the Ho-Ho, just to give you a little taste, I mean, at one stage they fought a series of wars, battles against the British, and their intention was to unite all the disparate Maori tribes in a war against the British and drive them off the island. Although Maori are considered to be one people, they are basically a confederation of tribes. and they see themselves as independent people. So the idea of bringing them together for the first time was something that had never ever been attempted before. Anyway, the Ho-Ho, one of the strategies Ho-Ho employed to do this was that they fought one particular battle, killed a couple of British officers, and cut their heads off and took them on a tour around the island, showing the force and power that they had in order to attract Maori to their movement. But whilst this was going on, the British retaliated. One of the ways in which the British retaliated was to confiscate the tribal lands of any group that joined forces with the Ho-Ho. Right? So on one hand, you had these Ho-Ho forces attracting Maori in their grievances against the British, and on the other hand, you had tribes who were making these decisions to opt out of this war. One, because they were independent and they didn't believe in this pan-Maori identity, and two, because their land would have been confiscated. Right, Ngāti Porou, the tribe amongst whom I worked, they stayed out. In fact, they went further than staying out. They basically, when Ho-Ho arrived on the East Coast, Ngāti Porou chased them away and joined forces with the British to pursue Ho-Ho forces. Right? In Ngāti Porou, this caused a civil war because some factions within the tribe wanted to join the Ho-Ho, others did not. So you had these internal tensions being played out. It was a time of massive upheaval. All right, so in comes Tukorti. He's accused of being Ho-Ho, prisoned on this island. Anyway, he gets this vision about the Ringatu movement, and he converts all the Ho-Ho prisoners that are captive alongside him to his newfound religion, Ringatu, which means the upper raised hand. And he leads this daring escape. He captures a schooner of the prisoners and sails back to the east coast of New Zealand, and from there he's pursued, and he fights this run-in battle with the British as he's pursued across the island, and this battle lasts for I think it's about 6 years or so, and they could never catch him, and he's a figure of legend. But anyway, I better move on. So, Tukorti, Ringatu. The Dread are descended from factions within Ngāti Porou who were allied to Tukorti. Right? So the tensions that this caused at the time in the 1860s are still festering. Right? It's an unresolved civil war, accusations of collusion and treachery being thrown around between these two factions in Ngāti Porou. Anyway, so that's the side that the Dread stand on. So by definition, they're on the outside of Ngāti Porou. Right. So this is the area I'm talking about. This is the east coast of New Zealand. Sorry, the quality's not so great. So my research, I'll set it up. My research is here in a place called Ruatoria, where the Dread live. But I kind of, for reasons like I said we might come on to later, I resided a lot in Hicks Bay and commuted in and around. The Dread are centred here, but they're scattered in this area. Here also circled you see Mount Hikurangi. Well, you can't see it, but I'll see it for you. That's Mount Hikurangi, and that's a sacred mountain of the tribe. So in New Zealand, every tribe has a sacred mountain, and it kind of it signifies their permanence and their residency on the land. All right. So in Ngāti Porou, the sacred mountain is Hikurangi Mona. This is also important because this is the key. This disputes over the mountain and the land around the mountain were key to this kind of development of the Dread.
Excuse me, can you just explain the Dread? Is that anything to do with the hearse and 150?
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that. So I just wanted to give you some historical background first before I bring them in. So
this is South Island.
this is the North Island. So that's New Zealand. Auckland is round about there. Wellington down there, and this is the area whited out. That's the area I'm talking about. The island. Okay, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so that's the area. As you can see, it's a sparsely populated area. It's mostly forest and farmland, right? Lots of forest, brush, scrubland, and farmland. This in yellow, running around the perimeter, is Highway 35. This is pretty much the only way in and out of this part of the country. Right? There's one highway that snakes its way around the coast. So this area is hardly visited. People stay away. They stay away because it has this fearsome reputation. People are said to be hostile, aggressive. It was a land that was never encroached by the British to a great degree. And so it stayed mostly Maori. So I think in Ruatoria, population is about 750 people, and I think it's about 80-odd% identify. No, sorry, 92% identify as Maori. So this is seen as it's got the highest, one of the highest density, highest Maori population densities in all of New Zealand. Okay. So it's very brown, as they say. Okay. So, in spite of it being a beautiful and said to be unspoilt place, it's hardly visited by tourists for these reasons. One, the road link. I mean, it was only about it was in the 1990s that the road was tarmacked. Before that, much of the road was gravel. So, but with farming and forestry, they tarmac the road so that they can ship goods in and out, out of the region. Not much comes in, lots goes out. Okay. So the dread, as I said before, the area wasn't. Not many Europeans settled, and because Ngāti Porou was successful in protecting their land against confiscation from the British in the 1860s, I think 80% of the land is still in Maori ownership. However, one successful group who managed to, of Europeans who managed to live and settle in the area was a family of missionaries, famous William Williams, and his children settled in and around the Ruatoria area. At the time, in the 1860s, Maori kind of liked the idea of having Christians and missionaries around, even if they weren't interested in converting, but they liked, it was kind of like a status symbol. Sometimes some were regarded as pets, some were seen as exotica, so they liked to keep these missionaries close to them. And they were generally, the missionary would kind of come and say, like, need somewhere to settle, want to build a school and a church, and the Maori would lease them land or loan them land, because Maori, for something, probably come on into the discussion, I'm sure I won't have time to talk about it now, they refused to sell land. For them, land was inalienable because it represents the body of the Earth Mother, right? So it was not theirs to sell; it was their parent. So this was the major reason for tensions between Maori and the British, because the British wanted to own land. Added to that, not only is land sacred, but what grows on the land is sacred also. Most notably, forests. And forests are sacred. They're seen as the domain of Tane, the guardian of the forest, sometimes glossed as God, but Maori see things in terms of guardians or atua, they term them. So this idea of keeping the land, looking after the land, nurturing the land, and the land will nurture you is something that is at the core of Maori beliefs. All right, when William Williams settled, over time, he went from developing a church and a school to saying, the missionary strategy was, I've got a family, I need to feed my family, need to grow some crops, could I have some land, maybe keep some cows. So slowly but surely, farming was introduced onto the East Coast. And the idea was that you can use the land, you can retain the land for as long as you're using it, but as soon as you leave, you give it back or you hand it back over. However, Williams and his descendants did not leave, and they did not return the land. Instead, they made it individual property, and so began farming and encouraging and loaning local Maori to farm also. Teaching local Maori to farm also. So many of these kind of like lighter areas you see, they're where lots of deforestation has taken place and the farming has taken hold. Historically it's been a really tough place to farm. The weather is hot and dry in the summer and rainy in the winter. It doesn't really get cold. There's no frost, but the weather can be quite hard, and the soil is tough as well. So it's just like the people, it's quite a hardy place. So the farmers would slash and burn forests, and this caused a lot of dismay amongst local Maori, just burning and cutting and destroying forests for the sake of cows and sheep. Mostly it's pastoral farming. Agriculture has been not very successful. There's been points where it's been successful, but generally it always bottoms out. So that's a little bit about the area. Where am I going now? Right. So as I said before, it's a beautiful place, reputedly. And there you see that's a scene overlooking Hicks Bay or Whanakahika. This is where I was. This is where I resided much of the time during field work. Looks great, doesn't it? I look back at it. Oh my gosh! But yeah. So that's as I said. So the tribe is called Ngāti Porou, and even the tribes take their name from an ancestor, and in the case of Ngāti Porou, that ancestor's Porou-rangi, right? So Ngāti means people of, thereabouts. So they are the people of Porou-rangi. They are the descendants of Porou-rangi. But within the tribe, you have these sub-tribal factions also, right? Different descent lines. And there's Ngāti Porou are notoriously quarrelsome, right? So there are all these people who dispute this idea that Porou-rangi is their rightful ancestor and all this kind of stuff. And this feeds... Pardon?
They don't even agree about that.
No. So, well, it's just kinship, isn't it? So it's just genealogy. So this much of those disputes inform the sides that people took during the wars with Ho-Ho and with Te Kooti. Right, so that's where I lived. I lived in a broken down caravan there, overlooking. That's Onipoto Bay. That's where girl lived.
Oh, yeah.
In Boy, and over this side is Hicks Bay or Whanakahika, the house of Hika, or Kahika, sorry. And that's where I spent 25 months much of the time. It looks great, but it kind of like perched on the edge of a cliff kind of thing. And in the winter, in the winter, the wind blew and the caravan shook, and the waves would just be lashing, and that's when I realised it's true. In case I might be the last one to catch on, but the sound of running water makes you go to the toilet, right? So when I first moved there, and the waves were just crashing every night, I was going to the toilet like 3 times a night. It was crazy. Right, so that was winter. In the summer, because the windows didn't close properly, in the summer it was like an oven, and the gaps were nice enough, large enough for mosquitoes to enter. And so I'd just be there in a kind of like a soup of mosquitoes just eating me in the pitch blackness. So you can't see them, you just hear them zzz. So I couldn't sleep. It took me a while to come to terms with there. And on the coast you had these this particular strain of mosquitoes. I'm not a mosquito expert, but these ones with banded legs, black and white banded legs. When they bite, it really, really hurts. So, yeah, it's not as great as it looks.
They're not malarial.
Pardon? They're not malarial. No. Yeah, that's true. So, anyway, Ruatoria is notoriously it's economically depressed by New Zealand standards, as I say there. There's little or nothing by the way of industry. Farming is at best struggling. So many, over the years, various initiatives have been launched, like growing grapes for wine production, which was going quite well until New Zealand discovered that they were producing too many grapes, so they pulled the plug on the East Coast and left it, so this is a place that gets cut off. Literally, the plug gets pulled out the East Coast whenever New Zealand needs to tighten its belt. Other things like squash has come and gone, kiwi fruit, all sorts of crops. When I was there, maize and fodder, maize was and corn was being produced quite a lot. Because cattle production has been suffering lately, many of the landowners can only grow fodder to feed cattle elsewhere. So here you see a picture of a shingle plant. So one of their exports was dredging shingle from, you can't quite see it in the picture, but beside there's the Waipu River, which is also sacred. So Maori hold rivers and mountains to be sacred. So you've got the sacred Waipu River, which is being dredged for shingle, which is used for road building. Right, another source of disaffection amongst Maori. So their sacred rivers being dredged, the watercourses being destroyed, it's causing flooding, roads are being washed away, all sorts of environmental chaos. And this is where the dread come in. So Maori generally operate a system of primogeniture, right? So firstborn sons are hierarchically superior to the lesser born. So in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s, when the economy of New Zealand was growing, cities were growing, many of the parents on the East Coast, they sent their firstborn sons away to receive education in the cities, become doctors, lawyers, or learn a trade, electrician, plumber, whatever. So all the chosen ones, all the oldest boys, were sent away to forge a future. Those who were left behind were, the future wasn't so great. They were seen as the Dread put it, they were the bums, right? They were the lowest born, and they were left on the land with not much to do. Anyway, the Dread, Tiahi, who you saw earlier, he, for him, this was a blessing in disguise, because whilst their older brothers went away to learn trades and and grow their fortunes. The idea was that they would come back and then develop the East Coast. These guys would be the new leaders. And the bums would just be, farmhands and the like. So the region is high. There's high unemployment in the area because farming doesn't require much labour, and so the Dread, most of them are permanently unemployed, long-term unemployed, I should say. They pick up odd jobs here and there, but they're long-term unemployed. So, I'll come into the Dread, I think. Yeah. Right. So, I'm here. So, unfortunately, this all feeds into the stuff that we might talk about. These aren't my images. These are images which were taken from a book by a photographer called Hans Nelliman called Moko Maori Tattoo, and he wanted to tell the story of Maori moko tattoos. In New Zealand, Maori, the word for tattoo is moko, ta moko. Right? And he approached the Dread to be his subject, and they agreed to participate in his photo essay. So these are some of his portraits. Maori aren't particularly keen on anthropologists. So much of my research was spent, if you like, downplaying the fact that I was a scholar. For them, the key thing is that you fit into their way of life rather than coming in as an outsider, determining, what's happening or drawing their knowledge. So, Maori being a hierarchical society, as an outsider, you come in at the bottom. So, I very much was at the bottom. So, just to give you a little background. This is Branch. He's now a carver. Patawitu, he comes and goes. Power of the Trinity, housewife, unemployed. Prince of Peace, tattoo artist. He comes and goes. He pretty much settled in Auckland. Morning Star, who's just recently attained a teaching degree and teaches at the Maori school in Ruatoria. Shiloh, King Glory, other core members, and Te Hoka-Whitu to your left there with his son, who Te Hoka-Whitu is a boxing trainer, boxing coach. And many of the guys, so what do they do? They don't do much because there isn't much to do. Right? What they do, right? So apart from bits of work, but what they do, they grow marijuana up in the hills in these sacred places. So much of my research was spent.
In sacred places.
Yeah, well, it's, in the Bible it's referred to as the holy herb, so this is how it's considered. What happened when these guys were left behind by their parents, when they were left to find their way in and around Ruatoria, many of them kind of like started to tug at the kind of skirt tails of their elders, in particular. And their elders, they seemed to, one way or another, they got the ear of elders who were still aggrieved with the way in which lands, sacred lands, had been taken out of Ngāti Porou possession. Right? So as Tiahi, who's not in this photo, in this montage, says, even though being left behind was a blessing in disguise, they were supposed to be They were supposed to be the bums, but they received the blessing by staying behind, because by staying behind they got to meet all their old queer female ancestors who told them the history of the land, all the sacred sites and the meanings of places and where battles were fought and where ancestors lived and who they were descended to. So these guys, even though they didn't receive an education, a formal education, they received a cultural education from their elders. So many of the residents in Ruatoria would refuse to go to these sacred places because these are where ancestors are buried. Many burial caves are located up in the hills around Ruatoria, which I'll show you. In the old days, ancestors were when someone died, their body would be hung in a tree until the flesh fell away, and then their bones would be wrapped up and deposited in a burial cave. Right? The Dread argue that the Dread were confounded why people were afraid of the hills, of their own places, why they were afraid of their own ancestors, if you like. And they weren't afraid. They were young and brave and foolish, and so they wanted to go and find their ancestors. So they'd go up into the hills. Their other elders will tell them not to do it. They'll die, they'll get sick, they'll get porangi. So the ancestors have the power to curse you and to kill you, drive you mad. Right? So they were warned against spending time in these places, but they kept at it. And through that, they argue they developed a bond, a connection, a relationship with their ancestors and ancestral places. And it's in these places where, for them, going up into these sacred, forbidden places brought them back in touch with the land, and land that had been unspoilt by farming, out of the reach of farming. So land as it was 150 years prior to them. So whilst up there, they began growing marijuana, and they grow their marijuana communally, and contrary to all the negative stereotypes, they're not drug dealers, as Te Hokofitu would always say, were for the healing of the nation, not for the dealing of the nation. So they would just smoke. So they would just sit and smoke and smoke and smoke and smoke. Right? And this is part of the whole. This is part of the whole Rastafari thing, which I probably won't have time to come on to, which is about reasoning. Is anyone familiar with Rastafari? So the idea that knowledge comes through discussion, right? So you reach a higher level of understanding, but a communal understanding. Shared inputs contribute to this kind of like growth of knowledge amongst individuals, and so that's how the Dread spend much of their time growing their knowledge through smoking and reasoning. Right,
She noticed that I used to visit the St Agnes Place
Okay.
very, very often. It's pretty much as you described there.
Yeah.
Lots of smoke.
So this is Mount Hikurangi in the background. That's the sacred mountain. It's in the foreground. You see some cattle dotted around, and so the source of the major grievance was that the land at the base of the mountain, spanning the circumference of the mountain, is particularly fertile, and this land was the chosen, the preferred spot for William Williams and other farmers. So much of this land was taken into private ownership, which meant, and fenced off. So for the first time, previously, Maori believed that everyone had equal access to land. All those who belonged to the tribe could go where they want, draw on resources whatever resources they needed, and could settle where they wanted. There are some conditions, but generally speaking, that's the case. But anyway, as you can see here, in the middle, farmers put up fences and stop you from moving around the land. And what happened was that Maori were unable to access their sacred mountain, right, without the permission of the farmers. Right, so they had to ask permission, otherwise they'd be accused of trespassing and all this. So the Dread began their campaign of land repossession, right, which was essentially, their idea was to make farming unviable by cutting fences and allowing the animals to just escape. This is a major thing on the East Coast because it's a huge territory. There's not many people and there's forests everywhere and mountains and hills, and when cattle go, they're gone. So
they established a cow liberation front.
yeah, exactly. Right. So at the time, the East Coast was also famous in the 1980s, up until the early 90s, I suppose, was really famous for people getting around on horseback. So these guys all rode horses, jumped on their horses, and they said, "There's nowhere you can go. You can't go without a horse and a pair of wire cutters." Right. So they just go wherever they want, cutting fences, allowing animals to escape, and helping themselves to animals also. You know, because they camp up in the hills and they just help themselves to animals. But one of the things they always did was, like sheep farming is huge on the coast as it is across New Zealand, but they would only take the kind of feral lambs, the ones whose tails haven't been docked, because you see when you live on the coast, or at certain times of year, all the animals get rounded up and they get put through the dip chemical treatment before they're shipped out on these kind of 3-story articulated lorries and shipped off to the cities alive. So the Dread would never take the animals that had been through this process. They'd only ever take the ones which are the lambs which were unpolluted, if you like. Right. So that was essentially. So what happened? But as I mentioned before, many Maori had by this time, converted to farming also. So they found themselves at odds with their own kin group. Right, they were destroying farms of their own kin group. They were opposing others in Ngāti Porou who weren't as concerned about the deforestation of the land, the dredging of the rivers, and the proliferation of pesticides and the loss of biodiversity and all the rest. But the Dread went to war with everybody. So this is why that kind of Te ho-ho history is so central, because it basically just came back to the fore again, right? So defenders of this kind of like indigenous way of life against those who were more interested in change and modernity. Right? So as these conflicts escalated, the Dread also started burning hay barns. Right? So you have these massive hay barns where they keep food, and the Dread would burn those. They take pride in the fact that they never burnt civilian properties. No one ever died. But and as they did that, the farmers retaliated, and they set up a group which the Dread labelled the Vigilantes. The idea was they were protecting their farms, but in truth they were proactive also, and they terrorised the Dread. So you had the Dread terrorising farmers, and farmers terrorising the Dread. The National Guard were brought in at various points. People lost their lives. I think up to about 30 buildings were burnt. And I haven't got pictures of Ruatoria here, sorry, I didn't get a chance to load them, but you'll see there aren't many buildings in Ruatoria. And they burnt down the courthouse, they burnt down the police station. And whilst this was all going on, Maori from across New Zealand were coming to join forces because this was the front line. This was where the battle was being played out. So if you remember in the first slide, there was the guy Horikuri, who I said. He was one of those who came to join the battle against European farming practices, if you like.
In the 80s.
This is in the late 80s, early 90s.
How many of them are you talking about? I mean, is this a large number?
Okay, right.
Is it just
Sorry.
Is it just late people?
No. In its heyday, they were said to be anywhere between 150 or 200 of them in a town of 700 people, right? But as this is coming onto this now, so as these conflicts played out, the farmers started to take increasingly aggressive actions, right? And many of the Dread were increasingly found themselves being imprisoned more and more often for, theft, property destruction, arson, drug possession, all this kind of stuff. So more and more of them were being sent to jail. They were just being sent to jail left, right and centre. Others were being threatened, their lives were being, others were being killed. So the group dispersed, right? So currently there are only about 30 or so in and around New Zealand. But what's interesting about this, in and around Rotorua, what's interesting about this is that for the Dread, this is all prophesied. This is part of the prophecy. There's a cosmological narrative in which something similar happened. Tane, who's the god of the forest, was charged in cosmogonic times. He was charged with going up to the 12th heavens to retrieve knowledge. When the gods first created humans, Tane was charged to go and get knowledge from the gods in the heavens and bring it down to man so that they could learn how to look after themselves. Anyway, Tane this is the kind of like culture of antagonism that's kind of rife in Maori culture. Tane was opposed by others who were jealous of the fact that he was selected. And also weren't keen on the idea that knowledge should be given to human beings. So Tane set off with a band of supporters on this battle because the idea of getting up to the 12th heavens was impossible. And each person had to present a plan of how they would do it. And Tane's plan was deemed the best, so he won the contract, if you like. And that was to ride up on the winds and go up to the 12 heavens and come back down. Anyway, many of his companions who set out with him were attacked by their enemies on their way up and were defeated and killed. So by the time Tane got up there, he was one of very few and made it down with only very few. So there's this narrative that in order to make progress, lives are going to be lost, and only a small handful of those who set out will ultimately be successful. And that's how the Dread see their numbers, the diminishing of their numbers being played out. The reduction in their numbers also plays out, also comes about because they see people's hearts weren't strong enough to endure the battle against farming and farmers, etc. And one other thing which will come on to the hopefully. Right. So this is a photograph of Jah Rastafari, who was the movement's leader at its inception. He was quite high-ranking, quite senior genealogically, and he was seen as a prophet, and he galvanized all of these young men and women, men in particular, who were left in Ruatoria and converted them to Rastafari. He came across Rastafari when he was in jail for one of his land protests, and he met up with one of the leaders from the Polynesian Panthers who had converted to Rastafari and introduced him to Rastafari, and he brought it back to the coast from Auckland. He moved, Jah Rastafari moved to the coast and introduced the belief to people who were generally quite resistant to Christianity. Anyway, so that just gives you a kind of sketch as to some of the stuff I said about what happened during the conflict. Anyway, Jah Rastafari was shot and killed by a farmer. The Dread aren't armed, not allowed to carry guns, and they just don't have guns. I don't know. They're not interested in acquiring guns. They carry weapons, but they don't carry guns. But there's lots of versions of his death. Not lots, but there's a couple of versions of his death which abound. He was shot and killed by a farmer who accused him of trespassing on his land. He was shot at point blank. The Dread say that basically he was shot in a way where he was bled to death, which also has ancestral precedent. It's about how a chief would be, because blood is sacred. Chiefs. There's a narrative about a particular chief who was killed, and his blood just flowed away. And the idea is that the Dread believed that the same thing was done to Jah Rastafari. His death was the catalyst for many of the Dread fleeing. So only the hardcore remain in and around Ruatoria. What else was I going to say about Jah Rastafari? I'll come back to it, no doubt. Okay. So why Hikurangi? This is an introduction, if you like, to how they see their mountain. Their mountain goes from being it becomes more than just important from a Maori cosmological perspective. It becomes important biblically also. So the Dread would always say, as you can see here by this quote, all the members, this is Mighty Hosanna, and the members would all trot this out. They would say the Bible says Zion is a mountain in the east, not the Near East or the Far East or the Middle East, but the Far East. Where's further east than Aotearoa? Right? So one of their campaigns was to have Mount Hikurangi renamed as Mount Zion, which caused disgust amongst Ngāti Porou. The idea that you guys can rename it something Christian as well, it's just, right? But that's what they wanted to do. So they see it as being sacred. So Hikurangi has this two-pronged sanctity, if you like. It's sacred because of its meaning to the tribe, which I'll maybe come on to in the discussion, and it's given sacred meaning by the Dread also. So in terms of their identity, right? So this is an image of Tiahi, and so these are traditionally the passages Rastafari draw on to explain dreadlocks, right? So it's a vow of separation and devotion and dedication to the Lord, and there are dietary restrictions also, but one of the restrictions is not to grow your hair and to allow them to form into dreadlocks, right? So that's what Rastafaris do more generally. However, what they don't do, as you can see, what they're not supposed to do traditionally, or in Orthodox Rastafari don't do, is that they shouldn't cut their hair, and they shouldn't shave any corner of their beard or make cuttings of the flesh. So for Rastafari, tattooing is a strict no-no. Right? However, the dread, through their reasoning, find vindication for their wearing of facial tattoos. Not only ancestrally, but they also find it in the Bible also.
Oh, yes.
Right? So they draw on Revelation.
Well, good one. Nice one.
And they shall see his face, and their name shall be on their foreheads. So it's not a great photograph, but there you can see his name, Tiahi Te Atua. Tiahi means the fire. Te Atua, God, the fire of God. So that was their means of purging. Right? All of them will have a Star of David located between their eyebrows also. And he also has Alpha Omega, which is another part of his name, tattooed on his head. The beginning and the end, the first and the last. Okay? So, and what else? And running through his forehead, running through their names, if the photos were clearer, they all have kind of like a rainbow running through their names. Right? So for Maori in particular, for Maori and for the dread in particular, the rainbow is a sacred sign. It was a sign that was seen as a sign that Te Korti drew on, and he drew lots of prophecies from rainbows, both white rainbows. They talk about these white circular rainbows, which Te Korti saw as a sign of good portent, and other rainbows also. So the rainbow is a really potent symbol on the East Coast, and it's you can see why when you're there, because the skies are often full of rain and yet full of sunshine. So you'll have like these heavy rains, bright sunshine, and a rainbow springing up, on a regular basis. Right? So that's a bit of their identity. That's pretty much. I thought it's generally. When I introduce my research for the first time, it's difficult for people to get to grips with without knowing the background. So I just wanted today to introduce you to the background. However, what my research is really focused on is cosmological narrative or ontology. How the dread draw their ideas from original cosmogonic acts, right? And for Maori, the original cosmogonic act was the coupling of Rangi Nui, the Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother. This is a kind of abstract depiction of Rangi and Papa. So green area is land, obviously, and the blue is the sky. And you'll see the kind of banding is because there are all these Maori see tiers, not as many as that, but there are 12 heavens and 12 underworlds, right? So there's these, and there are different denizens in each of these underworlds, right? So that's Rangi and Papa. They were brought together out of nothingness. Maori speak about, there's really some esoteric knowledge. They speak about these matter coming together and forming these bodies, and that's what's being depicted here. And these bodies became father and mother. Right? But in a more literal sense, the earth and sky are seen as locked together, or were seen in the original cosmos as being locked together in an internal embrace, right? So, Rangi and Papa just locked together, what they were doing, they were copulating, right? Just endlessly copulating. And as they copulated, their children were born and inhabited the cracks and crevices of their bodies, right? So you have just this mad process of reproduction, beings being born, and all of them, most of them, sorry, many of them, not all of them, were of human form, and these were the original gods. Right, so here you see at the bottom there, it's another famous image, Maori image. So the wave, that depicts the kind of bodies clasped together, and these are some of the children that were born and inhabited the spaces in between their parents. So as you can see, sorry, the resolution's not so great. You have Tawhiri-Maori, who's the god of winds, hail, and climatic events. Tane, god of forest, birds, etc. Rongo, the god of kumura, so natural root vegetables. Kumura and cultivated vegetables. Humea is the god of fern roots, so ferns, the roots were eaten traditionally by Maori. Tangaroa, the god of the oceans and progenitor of fish of all kinds. And Tūmatuenga, the god of war. The god of war and mankind. Tūmatuenga was the one who successfully copulated and created human beings. Right? Here, most importantly, that image is of Tane. You can see he's kind of doing a handstand. Right? So this is where, if those of you waiting for it, this is where Rastafari comes in. Right? So, or at least reasoning. Right? Or at least in my argument. Right? So these children, in the longer versions of cosmology, they are, the numbers of children vary and the players' roles vary. But most Maori can agree on 7. But sometimes it's listed as many as 86 or 92. And there are all these other beings being created as well, you know, insects and plants, everything's being created because everything is all matter is a product of procreation. Right? So, anyway, these beings, they kind of they started to get dissatisfied living in between their parents. Or some of them. They argued that they were too squashed. They weren't being allowed room to grow and to procreate. Some of them wanted to procreate like their mother and father. One of them, in one version of the cosmology, one of them was washed away on his mother's menstrual fluid and discovered the outside. And it was dark and black and cold. And he ran back in, crawled back in, got back in, and told the others, there's an outside, you know, but it's cold, but it's black. And some of them were interested in going outside, right? And so they hatched a plan, or they debated amongst themselves whether the only way they felt they could get away is if they separated their parents, right? So that they could have room to stand upright, find partners, procreate, grow, run, stand, do all that kind of stuff. Right? So starting from the top, this is where conflict comes in again, right? So starting from the top, you have Tawhiri-Maori, who was really, really close to Ranginui. He's the oldest. Tawhiri-Maori didn't want his parents to separate or be separated, and swore vengeance on anyone who tried. Tane was kind of like, he wouldn't have minded a bit more room to stretch out and stuff, but didn't want to cause his parents any harm. Rongo and Homea, they just go with the flow. And Tangaroa, he was called to go along with separation. Tu Matawenga, however, wanted not to separate his parents, but to slay his parents. He said, like, let's just kill them. Just kill them. Right? Just kill them. Right? So they reasoned for, in Maori cosmology, it's called the period is called the time, the length. And it's this kind of like unending span of time in which they debated and argued over whether to separate or to let their parents remain. Right? And that sets precedents in Maori culture. So everything that happens, say like on a meeting, in a meeting house, on a marae, official function, everything takes as long as it takes. Right? They never operate by the clock. They talk and talk and talk. And so when different positions are being debated, usually the winner is the person who wears down all his opponents. Right? Through perseverance, but also through argument. So the last man standing wins. And that is said comes from this precedent of talking until a solution is found. Anyway, Tane said, okay, separate, but let's not kill them. Let's just push them apart. Right? So, if we create enough space, we can inhabit the space. Anyway, they found that their limbs were locked together and they couldn't separate them. So the idea was they then agreed that they would have to sever the limbs of their parents. And so they did. They severed their parents' limbs. And they all tried to separate their parents, with the exception of Rastafari-Maori. And there's another god here who's not mentioned, who's the god of earthquakes, who was said to be he was a fetus at the time. So Papatuna was pregnant. So he's seen as the god of volcanoes and earthquakes, because his constant movement is what disturbs the earth. He was also anti-separation. So, like Rastafari-Maori, these guys are why humans have it so hard in places like New Zealand, because they are wreaking their vengeance on mankind whose ancestors separated their parents. Alright, so the way Tane separated his parents was by, everyone else was trying to push and had no joy. Tane came up with this ingenious strategy, which was to stand on his head and use his legs to push his parents apart. And so that's how the earth created a space. So my work is looking at these ideas of mono-ontology, which is the idea that all the cosmos was created from one entity, right? Whereas I argue that the cosmos is not created by. So you have these models of mono-ontology in the Pacific, in Polynesia. It's very common. Mono-ontology, where everything comes from this one form. Often the ancestor cuts up his body to create different parts of the environment. But here we have a scenario, and then you have polyontologies where each different tribes claim descent from a different original being. Here we have a situation whereby you have two beings comprising a collection of many, right? And so what my research is really coming to grips with is this idea of communion, this idea of sharing this one space of all processing ideas and being in constant contact with your ancestors, right? So with the ingenuity of Tane's solution was that by separating earth and sky, he props them apart with his body. So beings are always in contact with both domains. They've lost neither, right? So That's it. All right, one last thing. When the parents were separated, Ranginui cried endlessly, right? And they both cried. So for Maori, Ranginui's tears cause incessant rains, storms. And Papa Tuanuku's tears became the mist. Right? And the children were afraid that they were all going to drown. So they had to put an end to it because their parents were looking at each other really sad. So they decided to turn over their mother so she wouldn't be able to see their father, and perhaps that would assuage her grief. Right? But in turning her over, her body shattered. And so Maori argue that it's these shattered parts of Papa Tuanuku that forms the continent. And Aotearoa is one of these fragments which came about because of the turning over of Rangi and Papa. So I'm sorry I've gone way over.